Lord Buddha, we are what we think. Mano-pubbangama Dhamma. The mind is the forerunner of all phenomena. The first line in the Dhammapada. It's well known, yet all too often when we come to meditation, we forget it. We think that meditation is about simply accepting what comes in through the senses and going with the flow. In other words, putting the mind in a passive state, where phenomena are the forerunners of the mind. But for the Buddha, the mind is primarily active. That's one of the principles we have to hold to. That's why it was put at the beginning of the Dhammapada. Always keep it in mind. We're not just going with the flow, because most of the flows described in the Pali Canon go down to whirlpools, places where there are monsters, alligators, rapids, waterfalls, dangerous places. To follow the path is to take a stance against that flow so that we can avoid those dangers and get across the flow to the safety of the other shore. Look at the Buddha himself. He didn't simply go with the flow. If he had gone with the flow, he would have lived his life as a prince, maybe have become a king, and then been forgotten, like all the other kings, princes, queens, and other quote-unquote important people in the world. But he took the quotes off. He really did become important by taking a stance. Think of it. Someone who wants to find the deathless and will do anything he can to find it. That's the kind of person he was, the kind of teacher we have. So when we look at our own practice, we should cultivate a willingness to go for something more than the ordinary, instead of simply going with the flow. You see this from the very beginning. In the practice of generosity, you place yourself in the position of a creator. You create generosity. You create a gift. You can spend your time thinking about what would be a good gift to give to whom, and find some joy in exercising your imagination in acts of generosity, and then even more joy in carrying through. As for the precepts, you're strict about them. They're a promise you make to yourself that no matter what, you're not going to lie, you're not going to steal, you're not going to have illicit sex, you're not going to kill or take intoxicants. You draw that line and then you begin to notice. What are the things that would push you over the line? In noticing those things, you begin to see your own mind in action. Those impulses that would push you over the line also create phenomena. They, too, are forerunners of phenomena. What kind of phenomena are they creating? What kind of phenomena are they going to push you toward? If you hadn't drawn the line, you wouldn't have noticed. This is why the precepts are clear-cut. When this is put in negative terms, they're described as hard and fast. People are against hard and fast rules. But look at the precepts from another point of view, and you realize they're clear-cut. They're easy to follow, easy to remember. Now they may create some difficulties as you find yourself wanting to go with contrary impulses, but this is your sorting out. After all, this is what right mindfulness is all about, noticing what's skillful and what's unskillful, and remembering what's skillful and unskillful, so that you can use your memories to direct your right efforts. You learn how to say no to the voices in the mind that say, well, just this once, or it doesn't matter, or this should be okay, other people do it. Other people do all kinds of things. Even ordinarily good people let themselves get pushed around. But here again, think about the Buddha. He was not the sort of person to be pushed around. Think of the time he had to give up his austerities. The 5 monks who'd been attending to him gave up on him in disgust, but he didn't let that influence him at all. He realized that what he'd been doing was wrong, so he would have to stop. As for their opinion, he decided he couldn't let himself be pushed around by that. So always think about the Buddha, what kind of person he was, because he's the person who lies behind the instructions, behind the training we follow. He was a truthful person, which is why his mind was able to find the truth. He was the sort of person who, once he'd seen something was unskillful, would give it up. As he said, once he'd given something up, he wouldn't take it back. His image was of someone who vomits something out. You don't eat the vomit, you let it go. The primacy of the mind. As for things that are skillful, the mind has free range. This is what generosity is all about. There's a lot of freedom in generosity. There's room for creativity, and if you can't be generous with material things, there's always generosity with your time. Other people can give things, but it takes time to keep them in good shape, so see that as a gift, a good gift as well. I noticed when I was in Thailand there were some monasteries that seemed pretty run down, but they could have been fixed up fairly easily. I asked the local people about that and they said, well, that building was built by so-and-so, and if we fix it up, it becomes their merit. The merit doesn't come to us. I don't know where they got that idea, because the commentary is full of talk about how when you clean up the monastery, you gain in wisdom. The place becomes new because of you. That becomes your merit. So we look around and see opportunities for giving of ourselves. At the same time, we see opportunities where we have to draw the line and say no to unskillful things. It's in this way that your mind is not just reactive. This is how we know that the mind is not just a material thing or the byproduct of material processes, because if it were, we wouldn't be able to choose what we reacted to and what we didn't react to. We wouldn't be able to organize or choose our responses. We wouldn't have meaning in our lives. But when we take in the various events of the day and choose to organize a response, the more organized, the better. That's when we assert the primacy of the mind, which is what the Buddha's teachings are all about. As the Buddha saw, everyone has to go through aging, illness, and death. Nobody wants to, but most people just put up with it. It takes something more than just a material process to say, no, there must be something better. So here's where you assert the primacy of your mind, by laying down some rules for yourself, by giving yourself worthwhile goals. As long as you see that they're skillful, you stick with them. If you see that you've made a mistake, you can make changes and choose better goals. That too is part of the primacy of the mind. We're not a wind-up toy that has to do whatever the winder tells it to do. We have our sensitivity so we can read our actions. This is why the Buddha said that you need both commitment and reflection to nourish the Dhamma. You commit yourself to something really good and then you reflect as you follow through. If you begin to see it wasn't as good as you thought, you can change. If you see there are areas where you can be even stricter with yourself, well, you can make changes there as well. This then becomes the mind state you bring into the meditation, committed to staying with one object. If you already have practice in drawing lines for the mind in terms of your behavior outside, it'll be a lot easier to stay with your one object of concentration. At the same time, you've been training the mind to be active in thinking about generosity, thinking about virtue. And as you're watching the processes of the mind, those thoughts are good processes to watch. All too many people go through life letting their minds wander all over the place. When they come to meditate, all they see is that all-over-the-place mind. It's not very inspiring and it's not very easy to watch. So, as you practice generosity and are strict in your virtue, you create the external circumstances that are good for meditation. You also create an inner mind state that conduces to meditation as well, conduces to concentration, conduces to discernment. It's all of a piece. This is how you organize your response to the facts of aging, illness, and death. How you organize your response to the realization that you are responsible for the suffering that weighs down the mind, which means that you can make a difference. You can choose to stop causing that suffering. So instead of going with the flow, you go against the flow. You take your stance to resist the flow. That's how you find something really solid, because you've put your mind first and made it, from the inside, as solid as you can. All phenomena are preceded by the mind or the heart. I talked about how people tend to forget this verse when they come to meditation, forgetting the active role of the mind. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the topic because the principle is they're not only in that first verse, it's throughout the Buddha's teachings. After all, with the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha searches out the causes of suffering, they don't come from outside, they come from within. It's because of craving and ignorance that the mind creates suffering for itself. All too often we look outside, thinking that we're suffering because of this person or that person, this group of people, that group of people, but you can try to straighten out the world as much as you like and there will still be suffering because the mind is still churning it out. When you look at dependent co-arising, you find the same thing. Almost half of the factors are prior to sensory contact, our knowledge of the world outside. Among those prior factors are fabrications, your intentional acts, and acts of attention, the things you pay attention to and the way you pay attention. These will shape what you see as you make contact with the world, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and what you think. These things are all shaped by factors inside the mind acting prior to your experience of the outside world, which is why we meditate by focusing inward. If the causes of suffering were outside, we'd be sending you outside to search them down, but they're here, inside. We have to keep that point in mind. The Buddha's teachings on breath meditation underline this. We're not watching just the breath, we're watching the process of fabrication, the processes of attention as we watch the breath. I know people who say, why watch the breath? When you die, there won't be any breath to watch, so what will you hold on to then? But in the way the Buddha teaches breath meditation in the 4 tetrads of the 16 steps, the big issue is fabrication, the mind's contribution. As you dig a little deeper, you find one of the big issues is also attention. The Buddha wants you to see how intentions and acts of attention shape your experience even of something as basic as the breath. Based on that, they shape your general experience of well-being or not well-being. He wants you to see this so that you can alert yourself to exactly how much suffering you're bringing to the situation. All too often we look outside, thinking that we're suffering because of this person or that person, this group of people, that group of people. But you can try to straighten out the world as much as you like, and there will still be suffering because the mind is still churning it out. As we sit here watching the breath, we're getting close to the real problem. Just learn how to look inside. That's when you find where the problem really is. Then, when you see the real problem, you can solve it. In the first tetrad of the instructions for breath meditation, the Buddha has you start out by discerning short breathing and long breathing. That should alert you to the fact that the way you breathe will have an impact on how you experience the body. Of course, short and long can be extended to include deep, shallow, heavy, light, fast, slow. Get a sense of the variations in the breath. Then the Buddha has you train yourself to be aware of the breath in the whole body. Be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, aware of the whole body as you breathe out. The 4th step is to calm bodily fabrication. Bodily fabrication is basically the in and out breath. You may want to know, why does the Buddha bring in a technical term here? It's because he wants you to see the extent to which the mind's intentions play a role in how you breathe. We learned from other places that when you get sensitive to fabrication, you first use it to energize the body, energize your sense of the body, and then you calm it down. So, you're basically asking yourself to be careful about the intentional element that shapes the way you breathe. After you've used it to energize yourself, then use it to be as gentle as possible, as calming as possible. At the same time, you're going to be dealing with feelings in the 2nd tetrad. When we see the 4 tetrads laid out on the page, it looks as if you have to go through the 1st tetrad, and then the 2nd tetrad, then the 3rd, then the 4th. But the Buddha explains them differently. Keep your focus at the right spot. When you look more carefully at them, you realize you're doing them in parallel. While you're dealing with the body, you're also dealing with feelings, so you try to breathe in and out in a way that gives rise to a sense of refreshment. Breathe in and out in a way that gives rise to pleasure. How do you do that? The Buddha says that your careful attention to the breath is what will give rise to the sense of pleasure. Here again, the mind's contribution is what's going to make the difference. We're working here not with feelings willy-nilly. We're working with what the Buddha calls feelings not of the flesh, niramisa vedana. Those are feelings that are consciously, deliberately created. So again, we're working from the mind into the breath. Then you're sensitive to how that sense of pleasure has an impact on the mind. You breathe in and out sensitive to mental fabrication. In other words, feelings and perceptions. So, what perceptions do you apply to the breath? How do you visualize the breath to yourself? How do you depict it to yourself as you breathe in, as you breathe out, where it's coming in, where it's going out, how it comes in, how it goes out? You may think of breath as something from the outside that you have to pull in. You can breathe in a way that's comfortable with that perception, as long as you think of the whole body as being open to the breath coming in, going out from all directions, through every pore. After a while, though, you begin to realize that an even more calming perception is of the breath originating from inside. After all, it's the energy in the body that pulls the air in through the nose. The air can't force its way in on its own. Where does that energy originate? Ajahn Lee lists a couple of what he calls resting spots of the breath. Above the navel, at the tip of the sternum, the base of the throat, the palate, the middle of the head, the top of the head. Experiment to see which of these centers is most congenial for you to place your attention on, and then think of the breath radiating out from there without any interference. If any sense of tension gets in the way, think of it dissolving away. So again, it's the way you pay attention to these feelings along with your intention to calm the mind. This is what shapes your experience right now. Then you can find an even more calming perception. Think of all the cells of the body breathing together at the same time. No one cell is more predominant than any other. No one spot in the body is more predominant than any other. That's even more calming, both for the body and for the mind. Then you get to the third tetrad, which you're actually doing at the same time, being sensitive to the state of the mind and then noticing, when does it need to be gladdened and energized? When does it need to be steadied and made more concentrated? How do you release the mind from any of its burdens? You're doing all of this at the same time that you're dealing with body and feelings. These are all issues that'll be determined by attention and fabrication, attention and intention. It's what the mind brings to the practice that's going to make a difference. As you learn these lessons from the breath, you learn them in a very immediate and visceral way, and then you can apply them wherever you go. After all, the breath goes with you wherever you go, and you can take your sensitivity to what you're doing wherever you go as well. This way, you keep your focus at the right spot. All the things you need to know will be seen right here. Of course, you're aware of what other people are doing, aware of what's going on outside, but you don't let that awareness obscure your knowledge of what you're doing inside, because that's where the real problem is. As long as you allow this inside area to be obscured, you're going to suffer, no matter how perfect things may be outside. But if we can be knowledgeable about what we're bringing, honest with ourselves, open with ourselves, there's a chance for us to see what we're doing and to stop creating the suffering. This is why when the Buddha was teaching Rahula, the very beginning of the lesson was about honesty, and from there, being self-observant. What are you doing? What do you expect to gain from your intentions? Which ones should you act on? When you act only on skillful intentions, what happens? If something bad comes up as a result, you have to ask yourself, maybe my intention was good, but it wasn't skillful. Go back to the drawing board. So you reflect. Remember the Buddha's image to Rahula. Your actions are like a mirror. It's through your actions that you can see your own mind. And it's because the mind is the forerunner of all things. It's also the forerunner of suffering. And you can see where it's coming from in the mind. It's also the forerunner of creating the path. You want to be able to get it to develop the needed skills and observe it as it's doing that as well. The breath is a good mirror for the mind. Whatever intentions come up, whatever acts of attention come up, they're reflected in how you experience your breath. But we tend to look past this mirror and, as a result, we don't see ourselves. So keep the mirror polished and keep your eye on the mirror, because all the things you need to know will be seen right here.